morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Lee Kyung. I'm a member of the group Remind, which was formed earlier this year as part of the Philoctetes Center. Like Philoctetes, we bring together experts from different fields to take part in roundtable discussions, but also aim to involve rising stars in those fields, the next generation of experts, in the conversations. On behalf of the group, I'd like to thank the Philoctetes Center and its directors, Francis Levy and Edward Nersessian, for giving us this great opportunity. The members of Remind are Jonathan Lebow, right there, Cassie Kaufman, sitting next to him, Kara Elverson, where's Kara? There she is, and Dave Hecht, who could not be with us tonight. And please take a look at our section on the philoctetes.org website as well. Okay, tonight's discussion is the third and final roundtable in the series, The Art and Science of Politics, that has been held during this election season. Part one was Left and Right, which focused on neuroscience and political thought. Part two was Voters and Friends, Group Influence on Individual Political Belief. And tonight's topic, part three, is the design of influence, how words and images sway minds. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Stephen Heller, over there, who is co-chair of the MFA Designer as Author program at the School of Visual Arts and co-founder of the MFA in Design Criticism. He was art director at the New York Times for 33 years and now writes the visuals column for the Book Review. He's the author of over 100 books on graphic design and popular and visual culture, most recently Iron Fists, Branding the Totalitarian State, for which he has been collecting the graphic artifacts and detritus of the 20th century's principal dictatorships. Stephen.
Hello. I'm going to introduce the panelists first, and then I'm going to get you in the mood by showing you some political pornography. To my left is Steve Brodner, who I've known for many, many years. He's a caricaturist and illustrator. He lives in New York. His work is among the two or three most trenchant and witty of the caricaturists working in mainstream media today. He's been working for about 30 years, and he has a blog on the New Yorker website as well as appearing in the New Yorker on a regular basis. To his left is Jason Young, who's a professor of social psychology in the Department of Psychology at Hunter College. He's taught and conducted research in the areas of attitudes and persuasion, political sociology, and evolutionary influences on social behavior, specifically fear. So that's going to be a good topic for tonight. And next to him is Paul Starr, professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University and co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect, a liberal magazine about politics, policy, and ideas. And at Princeton, he holds the Stewart Chair in Communications and Public Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School. And I just learned he celebrated the 40th anniversary of the takeover of Columbia by SDS, where I was when I was 18 years old. Not at the school, but as an outside agitator. First, I'd just like to take you through some of the swag that we've seen through this election campaign, and the years, hopefully it will come up. Ah, yes. We all know what this one means and says, but I show this not because I come to damn George Bush, but to praise his typographic skills. He is the first president in recent memory that's used Photoshop and beveled type filters. This has become part of the, as you can see, because of his articulation and oratorial skills, it's been important to have bullet points behind his head so people can see what he's saying. And he really has raised the bar on chintzy computer-generated typography. Okay. Political iconography certainly goes back to the days of Jackson, if not before, and it all followed ostensibly the same formats. There were buttons, badges, little trinkets here and there. The typefaces were pretty much the same, bold, so that you could read a button from a few feet away. The posters usually had these disembodied heads on them, usually smiling. Collage was a wonderful medium, and that's what you see here. This machine is a little slow. Go. Okay, so typography has become, and I write a column for the Times online, the Campaign Stops column, and I do all the stuff having to do with political design, from the design of the campaign buttons and posters to the conventions. And because I write this column, I take it very seriously. Although it may not be all that serious, and that's something we'll address in a few minutes. But typefaces have become an important part. You've seen or heard radio shows dedicating spots to the type. The Baskerville that flipped off the screen very quickly was used by Hillary, and that's, of course, why she lost. The Gotham is used by Obama, along with that wonderful logo of his. And McCain, if we can get to it, I think the computer is against McCain, uses Optima, which frankly is one of the worst typefaces ever invented. But it does reflect the type that's used on the Vietnam Memorial Wall, the engraved type. There's a lot of souvenirs that have always been part of the political dialogue. We wear these things to show allegiance or to make our parents pissed that we're not voting the way they do. More buttons, just to remember Hillary. The McCain campaign follows a very traditional form. It's based on the idea of a monument. So you see the Starr, which would appear in a monument. It looks as though it's engraved. This is actually, I was asked to write something for the Times Weekend Review. I think it's coming out this week on the best buttons of the campaign, and this has to be my favorite. You know, if buttons could sway an election. And this is actually good. I mean, the McCain design is not very good, but I love this use of the great Amera McCain hero. So somebody was working. Of course, Mavericks using old Western type, and bikers for McCain using a belt buckle. Sportsmen for McCain, thank heavens for camouflage. And McCain, I don't think you ever knew this, but he was eco-friendly, and he sells eco-friendly items. This, of course, is the Obama O, which has been used in many iterations. It's very adaptable. Used for environmentalists, gay pride, students. I like that, students with notebook paper. Who uses notebook paper anymore? Even a kind of Man Ray-like approach to the future. You see this thing coming over the mountain and you're inspired. And then, of course, there's the Shepard Fairey Hope poster, which many people are arguing is too social realist and therefore sends this negative message when, in fact, this is probably the most reproduced and downloaded poster in America today, politically. Now, this was going a little too far. Can you tell why? Obama's not even president yet, and he's got his own seal. But this was in Berlin, and the Obama balloon hung over the city for 2 days. They couldn't shoot it down because the Secret Service was there. The Democratic National Convention was pretty tame. They did away with one thing. I'll ask if anybody can guess, but I'll tell you the answer. They did away with the donkey. And they made it look like American Idol. Very consistent in its design ethic, but still American Idol. And Hillary brands herself with the pantsuits. I never knew she had so many colors, but it was a perfect color for the offset. And then, of course, the what Sarah Palin called the styrofoam columns at the Denver Stadium, which echo the White House, which gives everybody the impression that he's already president. And then, of course, we go back to the Republicans, which was much more austere, ironically enough, since they are the party of big money, and, of course, reform of big money. Their typography and their banners were pretty traditional, low-key. This one's quite wonderful. It's hard to see this, but Mrs. Bush is over there introducing her hubby, and there she is, really teeny tiny. So they didn't do a lot of decorating of the hall, but they did, in fact, use monumentalism to great effect, and he was only there for 8 minutes anyway. And they also gave out a lot of hats. And the police were always ready for these characters, the demonstrators who always follow the Republicans like fleas on a horse or a dog. I'm just going to show you a couple of caricatures of one of the columns I did for the Times was to ask different caricaturists to get the vice presidential candidates, and the Palin balloon is my favorite. This is Nigel Holmes, and this is Rick Meyerowitz. He's smart, he's tough, he's got Barack's back, he's an all-American guard dog. And this, of course, is Sarah Winehouse Palin, which kind of segues us. Oh, yeah, this was in the New York Post, of all things. They actually did a funny thing, a satiric piece on Sarah Palin. This segues right now into the question I have, whether imagery in this campaign is overplayed or underplayed as a political force. So why don't you start, Mr. Caricaturist?
Well, I mean, I think it could not possibly, you could not possibly overstate what imagery is in the campaign. It's practically everything. And what's interesting to me is that the McCain campaign seems to be operating as though they have it down. Well, I don't think they feel that way anymore, but they've operated from the beginning that on the kind of the heavy research done by all the Bush campaigns and the Reagan campaigns, that if you presented imagery in a certain way, you could control the action. And it's very possible that that was happening until the market collapsed. I don't believe that that was necessarily a fait accompli, but the Sarah Palin pick now seems pretty dumb on many levels. But at the time, last summer, there was a serious danger of that actually capping a certain number of base votes that they were going to need, and then hope that other fears could be stoked about Obama that would help give McCain the 51%, which is how they've been operating, with 51%, divide the country up, keep people hating each other, and then win by a hair, or if you lose, still somehow force you, strong-arm your way in. And then reality jumped up and bit them in the backside. But it was.
Didn't you, as a caricaturist, see Sarah Palin as a perfect target? Was she a positive image in your eyes?
One that
could move the campaign?
It was moving the campaign. It was changing the whole thing. It was a tremendous bet that there was a thing about this woman, that this woman had some kind of a quality that was going to cancel thought. Like some kind of a superhero or like evil villain in a comic book that could just like send a ray out through her eyes, and the shadow, right, could cloud men's minds, right? So she was like the shadow character, Shadow Palin, and then it went wrong because she didn't have a second act, and then the economy went bad. But if she had had a second act, if she could have done an interview and passed the Katie Couric test,
right,
then it wouldn't have been Tina Fey time. But Tina Fey, I think, turned out, now that we're at the end of this thing, I think it can be safely said, that was as great an act of satiric game-changing as we've seen in any campaign.
Well, I'd like to get back to satire later.
Yeah.
But, Jason?
Sure. Well, why don't you talk to psychologists about images, I'm not sure I'm just going to focus on the graphic part of it. I think there are so many other images psychologically that have been painted, none more powerful than Barack Obama's face. And the fact that how it could be addressed, how the issue of race could be subtly referred to, and then of course all of the other loaded ideas that were used to convey images, such as associating with terrorists. Well, flip-flopper has been one in the past, and not quite as powerful this time around, although we've certainly seen a little bit of that. The latest one, of course, is the socialist notion of redistributing wealth. All of these are symbolic terms, and at the end of the day, the net effect of them is, how do you capture people's attention with an idea, all right, with an image, but with an idea that's going to get people to focus on it so strongly that they think that that is the linchpin, the turning point for them. And the critical factor there, of course, always comes back, in my research at least, to fear. How do you convey the sense of threat? And the use of imagery in this campaign has very much been a matter of how do you either highlight the threat of the other candidate, or show how you're going to rush in and save the day. And I think especially what's hurt McCain is he's been very weak on imagery that shows he can rush in to save the day. And he's almost put all of his eggs in the camp of how do you highlight the threat of the other side. And the biggest danger in any type of fear appeal, which is what we call any type of persuasive attempt that uses threat and fear, is it's only going to be successful if you can, at the end of your message, try to reassure the audience that there is some salvation.
So you
from
establish the threat, and then you become the savior.
Yes, and so I think they focus so much on establishing the threat, very little on showing how they're going to save the day, other than to say, oh, I've had more experience. And that, as a symbolic image, hasn't been that powerful this time, in part because both camps have a very relatively less experienced member. And certainly people said that was one of the big issues with Sarah Palin, is that she was so inexperienced that that almost undid anything that McCain could claim.
Well, he tried to jump in and save the economy that time, remember? He suspended the campaign. That was one moment he tried to actually demonstrate his brilliant leadership.
It was a symbolic effort, yes.
Which
and of
became
course
the root of great satire for about 3 nights.
Sure.
But let me ask you something. When one candidate goes on the fear trail, does that mean that the other candidate can't respond with fear? I mean, has Obama's campaign done anything like that? It doesn't seem that way.
Well, the issue with fear is, and negative campaigning in general, is that it's something that both candidates at the outset will typically say they're going to try to avoid. And the reality is, fear always comes back into a campaign, in part because fear makes its first appearance when someone's poll numbers start to decline, because that's when people are starting to fade from the public's view.
That's when they get scared.
Right. And so, well, the candidates get scared, and so they need to make sure everyone else gets scared. But fear is very effective. It's extraordinarily effective. It's one of the most primal reactions that we have. And in fact, there's not a whole lot we can do to protect ourselves from a fear appeal in the sense of it capturing our attention. We can try to reason through it if we step back, but that's after the fact. Okay, at the very beginning, when someone presents you with some type of fearful image, whether in words or graphically, it's going to get your attention.
Well, that raises a really interesting question. I mean, the first time I ever experienced fear in a campaign was the Daisy commercial, which only played once but became legend. But I saw it. I was there when it ran.
Yes.
And it scared the living shit out of me, and I wasn't even for Goldwater at the age of 13. What are the antidotes for fear? I mean, we know that we know that every campaign is going to do it. Yeah. It's just part of our lives. So is there any way that the public can immunize themselves? Okay,
is there a way to avoid ever being susceptible to the fear effect? Not really. What it would take in order to be resilient is to continually being on guard, continually questioning everything. And as I like to explain with my students, that unless you are prepared to exert that effort all the time, you're simply not going to be prepared, okay, when it comes out. And as a result, it is going to get through. And about all you can do is react. Mm-hmm. And that is what makes fear so common, such a continuous force in politics. And I mean, it happens in other countries as well. It's just we've mastered, especially with the infusion of a lot of the advertising creativity we have in this country, we've mastered a whole host of them. In fact, the Daisy commercial got a lot of attention because television was still a relatively new medium. And, in the Eisenhower years, there really wasn't that in-depth push to have something like that on television. But then Reagan, of course, had something similar with The Bear in the Woods.
Bear in the Woods, yeah.
Bear in the Woods, and a lot of people looked at that.
And Willie Horton after that. There are some classic fear tactics.
Yes.
Let's again talk about imagery. Are we making too much of it or too little?
I'm the skeptic, I think, in this group about the importance, the weight of this in the end. I think it's incredibly interesting. Those graphics that you showed us are interesting in their own right. Whether they will make a difference in the end, in the outcome of the election, I don't know. The great majority of voters come into an election like this with partisan identities and commitments. Americans now are voting their party ID at a very high rate, 85, 90%. Even most of the people who declare themselves to be independent on closer questioning turn out to be closet partisans one way or the other. This is now a country that is fairly well polarized. And so there aren't really that many floaters out there. Now, of course, we've had a lot of close elections. So even if they're a small proportion, they may make the difference. But it's not as though the vast majority are susceptible to these influences. Most people are influenced by their long-term identifications. In the case of party ID, it's often formed pretty early in life. There's change over time. Since 2002, there's been a big shift toward the Democrats. And that stands in the background of this election. It gives Obama a tremendous edge going into the election. And then people are also making retrospective judgments on the incumbent party, on the economic performance in particular. And generally, most of the social scientists who study elections believe that we can't predict with 100% certainty, but if we know party ID, if we know the performance of the economy in the year going into the election, and answer to the question, is the country on the right track, the wrong track, and so forth, we can be pretty confident about the outcome of many elections. Now, there are going to be some that are too close that will not be decided by these factors. But there aren't. Again, it's not the whole public that is being influenced. There is a portion that is susceptible to these.
Let me just challenge your skepticism a moment. The voters, at least some people are saying, the voters that will make the difference are the young voters. Get enough young voters out, or voters who haven't voted before, and it could tip the scales.
Yeah, okay, so this relates to another question which isn't addressed by this question of which side people are on, and that is their intensity of feeling, which may affect turnout. Mm-hmm. And so that may well make a difference, for example, for young voters who otherwise turn out at a very low rate. But if through these mechanisms that we're talking about, people feel more intensely about something, they're more likely to turn out, and that may make a difference in the outcome. So again, I'm not saying that this is of negligible importance. It's just, the thing that I worry about is that if you believe that image and spin and so forth are all there is to politics, mm-hmm. you may well feel, what's the point with democracy at all? I mean, if it is all just manipulation, if there is nothing underneath that really represents the intentions of the people, why do we have elections? Right? So I have to believe that there is some influence here. To some extent, the campaigns cancel each other out. They're each trying to manipulate symbols, and they hire pretty good people at it. and maybe sometimes in one of these close elections it does make the difference. But in the long run, I think these underlying factors that influence people's fundamental commitments, that influence their judgments of the performance of parties in power, that these are things that help decide the long-run sweep of history, why we get a New Deal at one period, why we get Reagan at another time, that it's not just the strategies that the campaigns use, that there are deeper things going on here.
Right. Jason?
Right. No, I just want to say, I mean, absolutely, party ID is typically in any review of what influences voting, it always comes out on top. And part of the reason for that is that represents kind of the mental inertia. I mean, if for no other reason, party ID is also mixed very closely into someone's past voting record. I mean, it's what one's parents did or what one's friends and associates do, and it has a tremendous amount of weight. However, the interesting thing is we don't just vote on the basis of party ID, because if we did, the proportion voting on each side in every election should be almost identical. Or, well, I mean, you'd have demographic changes, and you'd say, well, gee, it's all a matter of, well, is the new demographic coming in, the immigrants coming in, are they more liberal or conservative? But it's a little more complex than that, because there are people who do change their mind. Right. And so even though all of these images and these processes, I would agree, don't have an earth-shattering effect on the entire population, not at all. But they do affect some.
Right.
And those are the ones that are making the difference.
Well, I remember when I was a kid, and I was thrown into the Democratic Party early. I actually worked for Kennedy when I was 10 at campaign headquarters, met him. But what happened to me was I covered myself with buttons. You know, it was like wearing a baseball uniform or wearing a cross or a Jewish star. I mean, it became the religion of that party, and therefore certainly these icons, these images didn't determine where I was coming from or where I was going, but they supported it, and they ultimately supported other things. So the younger voters, the kids who may not even be voting this year but will vote in 2 years or 4 years, don't the images have some kind of psychological underpinning there?
Well, they serve to publicly identify them, certainly, and that in turn helps them to attract others with similar points of view. Certainly that can be part of the socialization. But I think a lot of the background factors that Paul mentioned, you know, about family upbringing, and that does have a very, very powerful impact.
We also had a panelist in our first discussion on the neuroscience of politics, Alexander Todorov, who's a psychologist at Princeton, who completed a study looking at
Faces.
faces and immediate reactions, and found that he could predict congressional elections in 2006 to about 70 to 75% just by flashing participants for 100 milliseconds the face of the candidate, their press photo, essentially their headshot, within 100 milliseconds, and asking them immediately afterwards, to what degree do you think this candidate is most competent? And that index was extremely powerful, which, to your point about the degree to which manipulated images affect things, I mean, this is something you simply can't even manipulate. This is before the manipulation even begins.
But from a psychological point of view, isn't this scary?
Is that scary?
Yes.
That's nature, actually. What's scary is we like to believe that we are in full control and deliberative control of making our decisions and arriving at our attitudes. In fact, a lot of the early models of political voting were almost mathematical in character, that they said, well, there's this amount of weighting for X and Y and Z, and by putting them all together, that will give us the most optimal prediction of someone's attitudes, who someone's going to vote for. We're finding now that, in fact, it's far more complicated than that, and in fact, a lot of times, and if you want to look at it as frightening because it's not under your control, then you can say it's frightening, but there are a lot of things that happen automatically, without our immediate conscious awareness, because of our perceptual tendencies. Perception including how we read faces. Perception including what we perceive as a threat.
Right.
And those are things that, I mean, a candidate who is savvy to it, and this is where, again, the marketing machine, I often say, I don't know that we have campaigns between candidates anymore. We really have campaigns between campaign managers,
Right.
because they're the ones who really tell them what to say, decide how things are going to be presented. And if they are savvy enough to pick up on the fact that there are certain signals that you don't even have to say explicitly what message you want to convey, but the signals. The Willie Horton commercial was brilliant, it was horrific in other respects, but it was brilliant in the sense that, well, we're not going to make race an issue, but we're just going to show a face.
Right. Well, Clinton's ties, although that was for another purpose. Steve?
There has to be a warm, moist host environment for a thing like Willie Horton to take hold. Why does Willie Horton work, and why does Bill Ayers not work? Why does Acorn not work? People look at Obama, and based on the work he's done and the exposure they've had to him, they say, no, it doesn't read. There's no narrative there. Dukakis had a narrative that just connected with. People felt that sort of made sense in some way, based on everything else they knew about him. So these things about appearances and attacks, there have to be other puzzle pieces in the right place for this to work. If it were just appearance alone, you're right about history. George Washington was our great leader. He also happened to be the tallest guy. He also happened to be the richest guy. And people naturally gravitated toward him.
And he appeared good on television.
And he was terrific. So they had the internet back then. It was all wooden with a crank. If that were to hold without any other factors getting involved, right now we would have the Romney-Edwards race going on. And clearly, a scarred old man got the nomination for the Republican Party, who on some levels they really hate. And an African-American guy from Chicago is running on the Democrat Party and going to win. So there are many factors, but absent those, I think the appearance factors rule as they did in '88.
And on the subject of height, I believe it's 75% with Gore and Kerry being the exception. The taller presidential candidate has won, which it's hard to identify a single other factor.
And hair. There's kind of a hair theory in politics, too.
Well, since we're dealing with
One with the most
couture
hair.
and coiffure, Paul, do you think... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to come back to the whole question of the relationship that these things have to democracy. And it seems to me that there are morally and politically defensible ways to think about these things and approach them in a campaign, and other ways that are indefensible. And we know the ways that are indefensible, which are efforts to manipulate vicious aspects like racism in the public, to manipulate in the sense of deceiving people as to what the real intentions of a candidate may be. But is there a defensible way to think about these things? And I think there is, because if you know that certain words and images will lead to people misunderstanding you, if you know that certain words and images will easily be twisted by your opponents to misrepresent you, then absolutely you ought to arm yourself carefully and choose those images and words carefully so that you are communicating effectively what you're about as a candidate, and reaching the people that you need to reach in order to win the election.
But can you really predict that? There are times... I was listening to an interview with... now I forget his name, but a comedy writer, and he was saying about Seinfeld that they expected such and such to be the catchphrase, when instead something else became the catchphrase.
Yeah.
The public responds to things on their own terms, not on the terms of the promoters.
Absolutely. Well, you can't control everything, that's for sure.
But that ultimately is what's been a problem in our culture, in these debates. You know, these pundits and on CNN, what did they have, 250 at a table? You know, they're talking about raising the red flag, going out there and hitting the knockout punch. Barack was too meek. There's all the. It is like a mud wrestling match with people on the sidelines, and there's a winner, there's a loser.
But they were wrong
Lots of
every
mud.
single time, those guys. Sorry to interrupt, but those pundits came out trying to straddle the fence on each debate, saying that McCain, he came on here, and you see the way he did. And then they get the numbers back, and Obama just gained 5 more points, and McCain just went down 5. So people are kind of hacking this out for themselves.
There was a gender thing going on there, by the way, in that particular discussion. All the talk about the wrestling match, those were the guys who were talking like that. Mm-hmm. And I think actually the gains that Obama made were more among women voters.
Yeah.
I think there was he wasn't that contentious, mm-hmm. and I think actually his very tempered style turned out to have an appeal that some of the commentators didn't really pick up at first.
Of course, the issue of pundits injects yet another level of kind of like what's unpredictable in human nature, is that the job of a pundit is to be interesting. And so to use an analogy like a mud wrestling match or something like that, they're doing that because they want to make their point, but they're also trying to make it as colorfully as possible. And they may do so in a way that completely contradicts some message that the candidate, him or herself, is trying to make. And yet we follow that too. And of course, campaigns hate the pundits because the pundits sort of wrest control of the focal point of what they're going to make salient, again, by using their own imagery. So
it makes it very hard for us to navigate through all of this when there's so many levels. There's the candidates talking through filters, then the filters talking through candidates, and then the pundits. Where do we stand? How can we navigate this rough terrain?
Yeah, well, probably the purest exposure is, let the candidates speak for themselves and do so in an open field, which, of course, we saw the debates and we saw that they had these rules that sort of restricted how much they could really speak to their own strengths. Right. But, you would think, let the candidates stand there naked or, just by themselves and fend for themselves. And, of course, that's the last thing in most cases that they're going to do.
Right.
Any of these debates, in fact, were very heavily negotiated behind the scenes because they wanted to minimize, being lit on their bad side or whatever.
In spite of that, I do think the debate succeeded in helping the American people see those candidates mm-hmm. for real. And I think
your
think
optimism.
I think people learned a lot from those debates about the character, the personalities of those two men.
Right.
So actually, I'm not usually an optimist. But in this respect, I think I want to take the more positive side.
Okay. Well, let me go back to couture, coiffure, and physical presence. Steve called McCain an old man, which has been plaguing him throughout. I don't think 72 is that old. Not as I reach 58. It's right around the corner. But it became the mantra of the campaign, whether you supported him or not. He was an old man. How much of this do you think really sticks with the voter in a positive or negative way, or is it just ignored as part of the goof of the campaign? The theatrics.
I think it would have been more important had McCain shown some signs of early dementia, but
he didn't.
I didn't. I don't think anything confirmed that potential take on him. Mm-hmm. Even though actually, there were these surveys last year where people were asked, would you consider voting for an African American, a woman, a Mormon, and then somebody who was 72 years old? And actually, that got the biggest negatives. But you can't really judge people's voting decisions on the basis of a question like that. Because when they actually saw McCain, and of course there's his mother, who's, 90-something, and she looks perfectly fit. So I think that issue really is not going to be a decisive one.
Well, except I think that the fluidity of speaking, the difference between Obama and McCain, does highlight a certain semblance in some quarters of concern about his age, that McCain stammers a bit more, pauses a bit more. In fact, one of the things that Obama comes across with quite a bit is he speaks without a pause, he speaks without breaking. And in fact, to add to the litany of various kind of idiosyncratic factors for the winning candidates, in addition to the height of candidate, someone once did a study of the rate of speech of candidates, and they found that the candidates that spoke with a faster rate of speech in general tended to be the winner as well.
How did Bush get it?
Well, this study was done before Bush. So
These things, the height of the candidate, the good looks of the candidate, and the rate at which they speak, they can't all be correlated.
I think that the age of McCain has been underlined in many, many cases.
Sounds like a book, The Age of
The
McCain.
age of McCain.
Oh, please.
The aging of McCain. He first engaged, it seemed, for weeks on end in a series of gaffes. One in which he couldn't get the Shiite-Sunni thing straight, and Lieberman had to kind of fill in for him on microphone. Then he pronounced Putin to be the president of Germany. He talked about the border between Iraq and Pakistan. He talked about, there were a number of things like this that he had to keep backtracking from. Then when he chose Palin, people started to realize, so what if he dies? And then they start to realize he's got a cancer history, a very extensive one. And in the last debate, talk about being photographed the right way, he actually was facing the side, his scarry side was facing the cameras. That, I'm sure, if you had HD, that didn't help. I'd like to see the number of voters who have HD and how they're voting. And then to top it all off, his erratic behavior and his speech, and then just next to this young guy who looks younger than 47 years old. I think maybe Obama looks maybe 37 on television. So I think these things did underline his age, and I think it became a thing that was maybe operating in a dark place in people's minds. The Obama campaign didn't use it, but I don't think they have to.
Well, maybe people like you used it as a caricaturist. What did you pick up from McCain that you use? You do partisan drawings, so it's not like you're a balanced communicator.
No, but I'm looking for metaphors all the time. Illustration and caricature survive using metaphor and surrealism that are evoked by your feelings, your gut feelings that are combined with your observations and what you're thinking. And if you're doing it right, all these things are working together, and something successful happens. So McCain started off in my drawings as a person with very clipped features, a little wide on the bottom, kind of, like a big-jawed animal, comfortable with chewing a lot. And then sort of like, as I drew him, it became more and more like a blob, and then suddenly like a potato. And then it's easy to draw McCain now. Just make this kind of like this shape, and then two eyes on the side, and then a line across the bottom. Everybody recognizes it. So in the course of the campaign, the evolution of McCain has gone from something of substance. I really feel this way about him, quite literally, that he went from a person who had an identifiable set of core beliefs, who people who were not Republicans actually admired, as well as some Republicans, a true cross-partisan figure, into something that was blurred and confused and mottled and mixed up because of what he was doing to his own image for fear of losing the hard right, ultra-conservative base, which left him being kind of a mush. And that's the way I draw him, and I think that's the way the public is kind of perceiving him to be more of now than ever.
Jason, how do you feel caricature affects our decisions or our feelings or...
Oh, it certainly can help solidify certain images we may have. I mean, there's certain ideas, certain feelings we may have tremendous difficulty putting into words, and sometimes a caricature can better capture that. Something that's kind of funny, but kind of scary, but kind of reminds me of my grandpa, or something along those lines, might come through in a drawing in a much more effective, impactful, memorable way than anything you could say in words. So sure, caricatures actually can have a tremendous effect, especially when they, again, without saying anything, can try to identify a candidate with some prior very emotional experience. So if you try to map McCain with some previous calamity of some sort, in this case making him look a little bit like George W. Or something of that type. You don't even have to say anything. And just, in psychology, one of the things we find is that letting people implicitly draw their own conclusions is far more persuasive and far more impactful than spelling it out. And caricatures are a brilliant way of doing that.
Would you say that there's any line in the sand? You talked about the indefensible aspects of campaigning. Is there any line in the sand? Is there any propriety that needs to be?
Well, if you say need to be versus is, I tend to look at what is, and especially if you look at American politics, people say, campaigns are getting nastier and nastier. No, if you look at campaigns in the 1800s,
Lincoln was savage.
There were this has always been with us. It's just the technology makes it a lot more reachable and accessible now. Is there a should here? Sure, it changes the discourse, and one of the things that Obama has been very effective in doing is saying, these are all piddling little issues off to the side, the Bill Ayers thing, and he just calls them on it immediately. Says, let's focus on the big issues, and if every candidate did that, that would be amazing. But the reality is that isn't a way for them to stand out. It works for Obama because he can stand out by being the one focusing on the issues, because McCain's not doing it,
right? And
that's what's killing him.
Paul?
So the one issue that we have perhaps alluded to along the way, but really haven't fully addressed, is race.
Yeah, I was just about to.
In terms of imagery, pretty tricky.
Very.
Pretty tricky, because some kinds of caricature that would be acceptable with a white candidate will not be acceptable with a black candidate.
You probably have a lot of experiences that you could cite where you thought you were on safe ground and then you weren't, right? That's happened to me.
Well, it's language, of course, words that somebody might use, thinking, like when Biden said that Obama was articulate, he probably didn't have a clue that there'd be any reaction against that, and so many things. So there are distinctive complications that Obama's candidacy raises, and
are these good complications or bad complications? For example, Joe the plumber said something, related Sammy Davis Jr. to Obama, and of course that ended his career as a plumber. Sam the plumber, yes.
Well, I think it's only good in the sense that I'm glad that openly racist language and images get condemned. There should be some feeling of restraint and anxiety about that, but it can well be exaggerated. And I think actually there were several examples during the primary campaign where things that, frankly, that Bill Clinton said or that some Clinton supporters said were really exaggerated out of context, and so it can easily be overdone.
But I'm curious to whether it's to Obama's benefit that he's a black candidate and that there are certain kinds of punches that are pulled.
Well, I don't think overall it is a benefit. I think there are clearly older white Democrats who are not going to vote for him because of race, and I think that there's probably a net loss. It's impossible to calculate how large it is, but I think there is a net loss. I think there is perhaps some benefit among it's perhaps a very small number of voters who think that just by electing Obama, the United States will, in a sense, buy peace with the world. That it will be such a dramatic move symbolically that it will completely change our relationships in the Mideast and elsewhere, and that may be an exaggerated expectation. So there may be some benefit on that side. It's very hard to calculate all the pluses and minuses. It's something people are going to look at very carefully when they analyze those election returns and try to see, whether or not there are more or fewer votes than the polls predicted and that other indicators might have predicted.
As a caricaturist in major media, how have you held yourself back in terms of depicting Obama, or how have you not held yourself back?
I don't hold myself back in that respect, but in magazines, you have to, if you're a professional caricaturist, you have to raise or lower the temperature of your drawings based on who you're working for. So the way I would draw George W. Bush, say, for Mother Jones magazine, is very different than the way I would draw Bush for the New Yorker. New Yorker has a very cool style. Doesn't want to be caught out ever attacking somebody too directly or in a full frontal way. That gets them into trouble sometimes. A little too clever by half, like with Barry's cover. Barry Blitt did the very famous cover of Obama as Osama bin Laden with the American flag burning in the fireplace. And David Remnick had to stop everything he was doing for about 2 weeks to go on Charlie Rose and everywhere else telling people, no, you don't understand. We're making fun of the people who are saying this. We're not saying it really. I thought it was a net plus because eventually it created an effect of everybody getting a little bit of an education about what satire is, including people who don't encounter it as a general rule.
It's been a great growing up experience for this country.
Say more about that.
Well, in large part because we should be able to talk about race, and we should be able to talk about if there's an insecurity because of it, in the same way that we openly talk about insecurity about Muslims. And the problem is not that we should talk about it just so we can get everything out, but because a lot of people aren't talking about it. But that doesn't make it go away. Mm-hmm. And my biggest concern, and of course this is the thing that the pollsters talk about, is they don't know what percent of folks who are currently saying they'd vote for Obama are going to vote differently because they just don't want to appear to the pollster, that they're racist, and that may be a very small percentage. But the way that the Electoral College works, that might be enough in any very close states to throw it one way or another.
Let me ask you something about the New Yorker cover that Steve brought up. Everybody's seen that, right? Yeah. It's hard to have ignored it. It was on every show afterwards. Do you both feel that it had a negative impact, the way critics were saying, that by showing Obama in that light as wearing a turban and the like, it just reinforced the fears? Satire aside, it was just one of these things that stick in your brain no matter how rational you are.
Oh, it highlighted the irony of how we deal with race in this country. And the biggest irony of all is, of course, it made that cover available to the very people who really are racist and would read it that way. Those are not the folks reading the New Yorker. And they're not the ones who would have interpreted it that way, but suddenly it was plastered on TV and in newspapers, and a lot of people suddenly saw that. And who knows what effect it had for those folks? I thought, and so it speaks to sort of the leftover guilt that this country has in dealing with race, that, we couldn't just say, yeah, of course it was a joke. What's wrong with everyone? We had to say, oh, no, that's not how we intended it. But of course, by making it available, we know there are probably some people who don't have to be converted into thinking Obama's a terrorist. They were already there.
Paul?
I guess it comes down to whether you think there's more of an effect from a kind of low undertone, with indirect suggestions and various kinds of images that evoke those fears, or something explicit like that cover, which brought it all out for discussion. And I kind of think that the discussion, because it was an indefensible position to take, that the discussion was a healthy thing. Mm-hmm. So I think David Remnick made the right decision. I think bringing all that into the open, having the discussion about it, was in the end a plus for Obama.
And also, there's this thing about irony. You know, there are places in the United States where people live pretty much irony-free lives, and
they don't get burned on the irony.
They don't. No, that's true. But they use wash and wear. And for us, pretty much here in New York, we have very little that's not ironic going on in our lives. So a cover like that is something we get.
I saw the sketches for that cover that Barry did, and he originally had him with a cowboy hat. And somebody said, "No, that's not going to work."
I think it was a great lesson that people and these ultra-right folks or people who would misinterpret the cover, I believe, and I have no statistics, but I believe there's a certain percentage of them that would look at it and say, hell, this is the New Yorker. They like Obama. Why would they have this? And then there would be some trail toward the understanding of what was intended. And to me, I think that cover was a gateway for some people, for a kind of an awakening or an opening up into ways of expressing yourself with irony.
Well, let's stay on the irony track. Comedy. Tina Fey has certainly made a second career for herself. Jon Stewart has led the charge. Bill Maher has been vociferous. How has this affected this election like no other election?
Yeah, well, let's just talk a little bit about what's happened with news over the last several decades. Back when we were kids, the 50s, 60s, up through the 70s, most Americans had TVs that just had 3 networks. They all had the news on at the same time. And there was a large captive audience for the news. A lot of people came home from work. If they could have watched something like The Simpsons, they would have watched it. But there was no other option. They turned on the TV, there was news. And so we actually have evidence that people learned a certain amount from being a captive audience for the national news. And that when the number of channels increased, cable, satellite, the internet, and so forth, about a third of that public that was watching Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, about a third of that public stopped watching the news. And there's another, about 10% of the public who weren't satisfied with the half-hour evening news. They can get a lot more on cable and the internet. They're the news junkies. Maybe some people here, they're checking, every 10 minutes what the latest polls are and so forth. And so they now can learn a lot more online and so forth. But there's about a third of the public that stopped watching the news, that does not read newspapers, that is much less well informed than it used to be. And some of those, sad to say, are young people in their 20s. The audience for the evening news has been aging quite dramatically. The audience for newspapers is also aging. So there is an opportunity there, and Jon Stewart and others are partly filling the void. They are. Now, their audience also does tend to be a relatively better informed audience, because you can't get the jokes if you don't know anything about what's going on. But I think this is partly the result of what's been happening over the last several decades, that comedy news can become so important.
Right. Do you think it has anything also to do with the direction the country has gone in? I mean, you wake up in the morning and I don't know about you, but I'm depressed. I like to laugh at the end of the day so I can wake up in the morning with a smile on my face. Because this is not new. It's just new in terms of how much media it gets. But there was always the National Lampoon. Before that, there was Mad Magazine taking jibes at popular culture. The Onion, which gave way to the Jon Stewart, the Daily Show. So do you think there's also this, from a psychological point of view, a need for this kind of humor?
Well, we are so much more fractionated as a nation now than we were decades ago because of, if just looking at what's available on video, on television, once upon a time it was ABC, NBC, CBS. Now it's MSNBC and Keith Olbermann, or Fox News and Bill O'Reilly, and I mean, people can go all over the place, and there's less commonality that people can have. I mean, The Daily Show is a part of that.
But it used to be there were Republican newspapers, Hearst newspapers, and there were, the Post was once Dorothy Schiff's paper. There were liberal, the fight was always going on.
And there still are. If you ask anyone about, the New York Times, of course, is ultra-leftist, unless you're for Israel, in which case it's not. But basically, I mean, people still see things as left or right, and you know what? That's okay. But if you ask any journalist about that, their attitude is, yeah, of course we only report one part of the news. It's the viewers, it's the audience's responsibility to sample across the different sources. And if they do that, then they will get a sprinkling of different perspectives. But no one does that, or very few people outside of academic circles and perhaps political circles do that. So Jon Stewart, I mean, he has a patter. And it's very popular, and it's very intelligent. I mean, I give props for their video archivist, for nothing else, which is something every news station should be doing. The way that they'll take what a candidate says and show what they said previously, and even better, play them side by side. When they would have McCain saying, I'm going to do something new, and then they played side by side something he'd said a couple of months earlier that was identical.
They've been brilliant.
I mean, it's far more effective. I mean, it's basically a video caricature.
Right. They've been brilliant. They've also been entertaining. I mean, are we becoming? I mean, we are a nation of entertainment. Is it a good thing that politics has become entertaining?
Well, of course not when it comes to dealing with complex issues. And in fact, what most politicians will tell you is that, and in fact, what killed Dukakis and what killed Kerry were these East Coast damn elites who, of course, were so intelligent they tried to describe the issues in such detail that they lost their audience. And the problem was they were probably talking about complex issues that needed that attention.
Right.
We don't want to hear it. And so, no, it's a big problem because we make people feel satisfied with a sound bite, and so the candidates play to that. But you don't learn that much.
Right.
I never have.
I think there's been a kind of cyclical change in which side has the better handle on comedy. So I think back in the 50s and 60s, Mort Saul and so forth, there was the comedians were more liberal and left, but then by the 70s and 80s there was a change when we had a piece of the American Prospect by John Chait, who now writes for the New Republic. He had just come to us from the University of Michigan, where he had been the humor editor on the campus paper, and he did a piece for us about how, in what he saw as the era of political correctness, the right was the place for people who had a sense of humor.
Yeah, well, P.J. O'Rourke for one.
But now I think it's shifted back. I think liberals have if you judge from Jon Stewart and Colbert, it's moved back to where it was.
I blame Ann Coulter.
Although, to be fair, Penn Stein, who is nominally more to the right, once made the claim that he felt the conservatives were far more funny because they don't believe in sacred cows. And because the left focuses so much on political correctness and on, uber respecting, which we would call respect, but he says the right you will tackle anything, and he felt they were far more willing to take on issues in a way that the left wouldn't.
Right. I did a column that was in This Week and Now on the Times blog about the poster child of the election, Obama. And I got criticized at one point, why are you always being so biased? And I couldn't find any McCain artists for McCain. Throwing their weight, I mean, except for a few country western singers, and John Voight. Why do you think this is?
I think that there is something inherently liberal, and I use the word in the sense that we live in a liberal democracy, about government. The idea of government is kind of liberal. The idea that human beings can have problems and human beings can organize themselves in ways to solve problems. We've just seen 8 years of an experiment where both houses of Congress, pretty much, and the White House were run by people who, no matter what the problem was, except for the war, felt that government was useless and would actually hire people who were good at dismantling government and ignoring the potential for helping people. And similarly, I think the act of media is somewhat liberal. You will have anyone but the hardcore Bush supporters scoffing at the idea that Fox is a serious news source. A lot of people watch Fox for entertainment value. They like the smiley, jokey people in the morning, or O'Reilly. I know a lot of liberals who enjoy O'Reilly. I think that to be ready to criticize people in power implies a readiness to organize in some way to correct it. And, on the vast sliding scale, it's somewhere liberal to question authority. And I think people who are right-wing humorists are kind of being liberal when they're being humorists. They're opening things up to question. It's the Sarah Palin, George W. Bush impulse not to question, to keep things shut down, locked down in an undisclosed location. That's when conservatism and the right is finding its fullest expression, in my opinion.
I want to ask one last question before we go to the audience, and this is just a pet question of mine. Is there such a thing as political imagery etiquette? For example, I went to a party last night on Fifth Avenue that was the home of a Republican person, and I wore my Obama button. And there were other people there who were Obamas, and I said, so where are your buttons? And he said, well, we didn't want to insult the hostess, who, it turned out, switched and is now going with Obama.
Congratulations.
But is there an etiquette in this country? I mean, are we supposed to keep our views to ourselves and not to hurt the next person by being insulting or something?
Funny you should ask that, because an issue has come up at my college, at Hunter College, that apparently one of the faculty was wearing an Obama button. And apparently someone complained, and the question was, was it appropriate for that person to wear it? And I assumed it would be a student complaining. It turned out it was another faculty member complaining.
So much for academic freedom.
Well, I mean, since we live in a country that has the First Amendment and there's freedom of expression, I mean, that etiquette is almost preordained that of course you're allowed to express it. The really interesting thing is, at what point do people feel you've crossed the line and are doing it kind of in your face, as opposed to merely expressing yourself? And campaign buttons sort of have an established enough tradition that probably shouldn't be seen as all that offensive by folks. I mean, it depends on the social circles you're hanging out with if they want to hear what you genuinely believe or not. But if anything, I think people have become less reluctant. I mean, certainly the issue of lawn signs. Apparently, the lawn signs used to be far more popular than they are now. And bumper stickers. Someone once said, people are more worried about marking up their cars. Some people still have bumper stickers, but they don't quite have the same cachet that they once did. And so the challenge now is, how do how do you break through?
Right.
But these are the things that have the personal touch. So,
Paul?
Well, it's funny you ask this question because I have a piece coming out in the New Republic in the next issue about partisanship, and the last part of it is about an ethic of partisanship. And one of the issues that I take up is the whole question of where partisanship stops, and how there's been a tremendous rise of partisanship in America. There's an intensification of partisanship, and it's spilling into many other areas of life besides politics. And yet, I don't think partisanship really ought to be a governing value, or indeed really ought to be present at all in certain places, like the classroom, and or the sciences, or the churches, right? But each of those areas, religion and science and education, has become subject to partisan divisions. And so it's very difficult to keep partisanship in its place. And but
you are saying it has a place.
It does have a place. Absolutely, it has an important place in our politics and our culture. It's absolutely legitimate to wear that button. But I would say not in the classroom. I would be upset if a clergyman got up in the pulpit wearing that. That seems to me to be an inappropriate use of a certain kind of authority.
It's an interesting thing you say that, because I went to the president of my school to ask whether I could give a political talk. It was a history of political graphics, but it would have an edge, because I would be talking about propaganda, and he said, sure, as long as you don't penalize any student for disagreeing with you.
Right. Well, what I would be afraid as a professor is that if indeed I had a button, it would chill the discussion. It would undermine the whole purpose.
Even if you give the caveat that.
Yeah.
I think we should go to the floor. Yes, sir.
Would you be comfortable expressing your political views?
We have to have you come up to the microphone because it's being recorded.
I have to remember, but
I'll help you.
it's not worthy of a microphone.
We'll be the judge.
There's an audience who watches this.
Would you be comfortable expressing your partisan views 15 feet from the entrance to the classroom? Or outside the door? I mean, is there any difference between, or are you stopped from expressing yourself because you're a teacher?
There are difficult distinctions to draw. Like the college Democrats asked me to come to a meeting and talk to them. I had no inhibition about talking in that context from a partisan point of view.
You know, the same students that you were teaching in the class were at that meeting?
There might have been one, would be the same.
You can't know that.
But no, no. It's a matter of the different role that one plays in different contexts, and it has to do particularly with this question of authority. I mean, a professor gives out grades and so forth, and you have to, I think, be very careful about how you exercise them.
Reform. The potential for you to penalize a Republican, which would be okay, could be depending on where you are, whether you wear a button in the class or you express yourself outside in an article or in an interview and whatever, is the same potential. I mean, it's just a symbol.
But it's more than a symbol, because it would affect what actually happens in the classroom, I believe.
This woman.
Excuse me for taking the shortest path. So I'd like to get back to imagery. And Steve Brodner made many interesting, all of you made many interesting comments, but you commented on how your caricature of McCain changed. And it changed in a way that fit his blurriness. So I'm wondering, could you have had McCain turned out to be articulate and Obama turned out to be vague, could you have caricatured Obama to be vague and McCain to be articulate? So how much does the visual caricature express the personality and still capture the physical.
Whose personality are you speaking of? Mine or the
It becomes.
Well, it's highly subjective, so it's through the point of view of the artist. But I like to think that we're very honest, and a caricature stinks if it's completely off key. You know, you've got to really find the right key for it to land, like a joke. If there isn't a grain of truth in it, then it's a failure. It just doesn't land. So what you do has got to be informed by what's really happening.
I guess what I'm asking is, how do you get personality into the way a person looks?
Oh boy! You got some paper? You want to? I'll go up to the board.
Chalk talk.
What caricature is, I think it's a misunderstood art form. A lot of people think that it's a kind of, and some very good practitioners as well, who think that it's a matter of having fun with exaggeration and making big things bigger and small things smaller. And for me, these are the tools you use to get to something else. And to me, the destination is that it's possible to look at a face and with a certain amount of information and understanding about what's under the surface, to bring to the surface, using the arrangement of features, what has been underneath. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to do. Like, for example, with Ronald Reagan, who if you come to my studio, I can show you his facelift. The before and after pictures, if you look at 76 and 80, wow, different people entirely. Very hard to draw a person whose face has been reconstructed to look like he did in the first place, which was the accurate Reagan. That was the real Reagan. But the other end of the spectrum would be somebody like Richard Nixon, who does everything for you. You don't have to work. You can just do it in your sleep. Or Newt Gingrich, who look like what they are. You don't have to really...
How hard was Bush?
Oh, a walk in the park.
Gonna miss him?
Not a second will I miss it. There'll be others. We'll find other people.
Well, what's going to happen if Obama does become president?
I'm screwed.
You are.
Yeah.
I mean, caricature, unless it's entertainment, pure entertainment, is oppositional by its very nature.
I have a plan.
Let's hear it. We're all ears.
CEOs.
There's a question over there.
Sorry. I noticed that in terms of the design of influence, it says how images, words sway minds. And I was also heard what Mr. Starr said. What about issues? And the question might be, part of the question is, isn't it that they can change from one party to another so much because there's so much the same? I mean, if you look at Hillary Clinton or even Obama, in terms of Iraq, for example, what are they going to do, say, when Obama becomes president in terms of Afghanistan or Iraq? Will it be that different from what Bush has done? You know, all the Democrats, or most of the Democrats, voted to go into Iraq. Or if you take the economy, when push came to shove, and the economy got so bad that they had to have a bailout. And then, in addition to the bailout, they had to buy the banks somewhat. Bush did it. Now, image, as compared to issues. And yet, at the same time, we do know, don't we, that if things get real bad, that even if they're Democrat or they're Republican, through their parents or for whether they are, they're going to vote for the other party. And then possibly in 8 years or whatever, although this thing, it'll be the other party.
That's when the critics will take over and the satirists will take over.
That's what, no, I don't, well, maybe yes, but maybe for 8 years. I doubt it with Palin. They'd have to get somebody else. But it seems to me that that should have been part of it too, as Mr. Starr said.
Question.
Look, what's the question? The question is, why isn't issues here as much as these other, in terms of design of influence?
Why don't you let them answer?
Well, you got a problem? Well, that's your problem.
It was a good question.
It was a good question.
I think, first of all, these are not mutually exclusive. Many of these questions about images and symbols relate directly to the issues. And I think it's the way that many voters make judgments about the issues. They make it through these images. These images are often laden with meaning, with political meaning. So people are picking up cues from the kinds of images. And actually, they're picking up cues also from the kinds of issues that the candidates raise. Because Obama raises the issue of health care, people make a judgment about him merely because he raises that issue and injects it into the debate. So in a way, sometimes issues are symbols.
Right. In the column that I do on campaign stops, very often there are criticism in the comment section. Why are we talking about images when we should be talking about something else? And we're told not to interject to talk to the people who make comments because we've had our say and now it's their turn. But there are always, it's a kind of I'm losing my words. Other people come in and make their comments known, and it's like, if you want the issues, go to that column over there. We have different columns for different purposes. And this is this broad election where a lot of things are taking place. And if we can't cover them all, we're the lesser for it.
There's another piece to that, too, is that images are far easier to digest. Issues take time, a lot more effort. We can say the issues are the issues are the image. True. But for instance, tonight's talk and talking about the role of images, the reality is, again, much as we'd like to believe, everyone is focusing only on issues. They're not, and the problem is that is kind of what we used to consider noise, the fluff part of politics, and it's not. It in fact controls, in large part, a lot of what is done. And that's the problem.
Steve?
I know there are a lot of questions. I just want to say this briefly. The I guess now classic book, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, talks about the results of his research having tracked advertising from the 19th century. And he notes that there's a time prior to the turn of the century when advertising was about giving you information about a product and appealing to your sense of reason about why you would buy this thing. And it made a case with logic as to why, this soap was better. And then suddenly it changed. And he notes and says something like, there was a point at which advertising was going to be about imagery, and that appeals to reason were going to have to be held somewhere else. And so advertising for the last 110 years has been like that. And then in his book, he argues that since the coming of television, politics has been like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and interesting, there was a recent paper that looked at inaugural speeches, and they found that early presidents' inaugural speeches focused much more on the exact plans that they had in store for various issues, and that in more recent years, there's cursory review of those issues, but far more focus on symbolic issues to sort of rally the public.
Well, it's someday in the not too distant future, the inaugural speeches will be preempted for American Idol. Yes.
I just wanted to pick up on that exact point about that you were talking about a book. It still blows my mind when I heard that the father of American advertising and PR was Edward Bernays,
Freud's nephew.
Who turns out to be Sigmund Freud's American nephew, who was in charge of getting Freud's books published in this country. So from 1921 on, his book Propaganda, 1928, makes Karl Rove look like he's in kindergarten. He got Reagan to be the GE practitioner, but he sold Freud's ideas to big business, the military, and politics in 1921, using all of Freud's ideas before they even got out to the public. So I'm just curious, from your experience and background, if you kind of know about this psychological background, the father of psychology, it's like the American president of the American Tobacco Company in the 20s was teamed up with a German psychologist to get women to smoke by saying when a woman lights up a cigarette, she's like the Statue of Liberty lighting up her torch of freedom, declaring her power and independence as a woman. And that was
It was in the 20s.
In the 20s.
He literally killed two birds with one stone. He got women to vote, and he got them to smoke.
But he not only that, he wrote the scenarios for the CIA in the Banana Republics.
Right.
When I was a kid growing up, the thing about hiding under the desks and his whole thing, fear, if you can get kids in kindergarten, you've got them for life.
Do you think it would have happened without him?
No, I'm not sure. Maybe
Well, the Jesuits did that.
I don't want to talk here because you guys are the experts.
But I see this all as just market research. If he didn't make the amazing discovery, somebody else would have. You weren't going to stop the sweep of psychology.
But I don't know if it was the fact that he was Freud's nephew and had firsthand.
He had knowledge.
But there were others. There were others like Le Bon, who was studying the mass consciousness. There were a few people who were already dealing in this realm of pre-psychology.
So the flip side.
There was Walter Lippmann's first book, 1913, A Preface to Politics, all about the role of the irrational in politics. This is something that has been discussed and for a long time. And so Bernays was certainly an important figure in this history.
I don't know how much he knew about Freud's ideas anyhow, just because he was the nephew.
This is the flip side of my question, is that I've been looking at a concept that's been around for about 35 years called visual literacy or visual education. Say 90% of all the information we get is delivered in a visual way. Looking at these things, and especially as people who are in the field, maybe having a responsibility as well to educate people, how would you go about educating people about the power of imagery and what it does?
Well, that's what we do at the School of Visual Arts. And some people listen and some people don't. And some people take the lessons, as you're saying about Bernays, and go ahead and manipulate people because it's a great lesson. But we live in a culture. We live in a market-driven culture where we propagandize, and that's what Bernays said. Propaganda was good for the health of the country, because it got information out. Of course, it was his information or Laurel Lard's information or whatever. You have a great voice, by the way.
I do anyway.
There's another question.
Okay, thank you.
Find your way.
You should have sat over here.
This is a failure of design.
I feel like that another unspoken thing is the sort of the sui generis nature of this administration specifically as it relates to truth and image. That this particular administration has been unbelievably adept and sort of hyper-focused on manipulating the image and not actually governing or competence or anything like that. And I think that the job of president is communication, so maybe that's why John Kerry couldn't make the case well in 2004, even though it seemed to many of us what was obvious. But now it just seems inescapable in 2008 to enough of the people that even though a black guy who has 4 years or less in the Senate is running, that clearly he is the only one that's talking on a new plane in a different vocabulary. McCain seems to be stuck in the echoes of the 2000 campaign that he ran, and he had some success, and so he tried that again. And I don't think it's that he's old. I think that he hasn't articulated something different than what we've heard, and that's why the Jon Stewarts of the world have been so effective, and so on. So I'd just like to know what you think about that.
Good question.
Always the good way to end.
Well, for starters, certainly both Cheney and Rove were masters at marshaling fear in their favor. And anything that McCain has attempted to do that follows suit has essentially backfired. He does not have the same ethos that Rove and Cheney had. And this speaks also to the previous gentleman's question, too, about how is it you don't how do you teach everyone about something, whether it's political or otherwise? You've got to come up with a particular technique that's going to make it such a central focus for everyone.
Isn't that fear?
And that's very difficult to do. And I mean, if it can ride on fear, that's certainly one way of doing it. I mean, how many of us 6 months ago were really thinking about the economy? I mean, if you're in an area where there was a lot of job loss, but in New York City, how many of us were really thinking about it? Now it's on everyone's mind. And it's because, of course, it's couched by pundits and by others in this sort of, it's called a crisis. But the truth is, and it's interesting because I love to go back and see how things were reported in 1929 while they were going through it. Because I'm sitting here thinking, geez, is this a crisis? It's a crisis if you need your money right away. It's a crisis if you're going to lose your job. But it's sort of interesting seeing that, well, we're talking about a meltdown. But at the same time, life is going on. And upon reflection, we always like to think that things are so hyper, histrionically dramatic. And the reality is there's always a kind of a life goes on element. After 9/11, people's views of New York is that New York just stopped for several months. It stopped for a couple of weeks. But the reality is life went on. And things are never as severe. And so the problem is that's why it's so difficult to get any particular issue to catch on, to get people to hold on. But for the moment, yes, fear is the most effective way.
Well, I think as it's turned out, there is a mismatch between the frame that McCain was preparing and the frame that the economic crisis has created that is really shaping what voters are thinking about. If there had been a national security crisis this fall, and let's hope there is none in the coming weeks. But if there had been one, and that had dominated the news, and that was all we were talking about, we might also be thinking about this election differently, and it might be that we would look on the McCain campaign as having been just brilliant. And God damn it, they did it again, just as they did in 2000 and 2004. It hasn't worked out for them this time. But that's because there are realities, which are the most powerful frames, no matter what images people use. And the reality of what's happening in the economy is affecting people very directly. And I think that ultimately is maybe the deciding factor.
So reality is the most powerful image.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Steve, I have a question.
Yeah.
You're smart. A quick question, maybe Frank can follow. A question about
You've got to be smarter than him.
Remarkable level of restraint that Obama showed in all three of the debates, a willingness to quite literally pull his punches on lots of occasions. How much of that do you think was his actual zen, cool temperament, the no shock, Barack, no drama, Obama, and how much was a very conscious, very calculated decision to at no point in time did he dare look like or allow himself to be perceived as an angry black man?
Ackerman is our Rove. He's brilliant. He's handled this campaign brilliantly. He handled it brilliantly against Hillary Clinton, whose campaign imploded. Or she'd be the nominee right now.
Because I'm wondering if the Jackie Robinson historical analogy isn't very applicable here, where Jackie Robinson would take the most horrible abuse. He would continue to smile because he knew that he was the first to break that particular glass ceiling, this glass ceiling, and it just sort of came with the territory.
You mentioned what is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Obama campaigning strategy, which is it is so carefully controlled and choreographed that we haven't caught him off guard. And I mean, what you're really asking is exactly when, I don't know if you watched CNN for the last debate when they had the split screen, whenever Obama was speaking, they showed all these different facial expressions that McCain was making, which of course the Daily Show made light of to no end. Obama sat there absolutely in sort of a zen pose, with a smile and very calm. And if he's been taught to do that, or if that's his natural repose, We don't know.
But is there anything wrong with it?
No,
That's
you
the
posed
question.
it as a choice between whether it was his
Right.
temperament or
Right,
whether
right,
it was.
right.
It's both. I mean, I think they rehearsed those
reinforce each
debates.
other,
He probably couldn't
planned
have done it if
as
it
much-
wasn't part of his temperament.
Right, because many other candidates couldn't possibly carry it out.
Yeah.
They would just lose it.
But we've been seeing this now for 20 months with him.
Yeah.
And chances are, if somebody can be that consistent, it's probably a reflection of the man.
Let's let Frank ask his question because it's his bat and ball.
Actors have to do this every night.
But this is day in, day
I just
out.
had a little question. Am I interrupting you, Steve?
I'm sorry?
Go ahead, finish.
No. I just said he's been doing it day in, day out. We would have seen him crack if he wasn't really liked. I suspect he has this kind of temperament that we're seeing an aspect of him as a person.
Mine went back to your point about partisanship, and that is this the image creation leading to a good-bad view of the world? Kind of images over, it goes back to images and issues. And I say that in the context of this being an analytic institute. There's a branch of analysis which is not really represented here so much as the interpersonal object relations, in which they talk about good and bad objects. So I was going, the partisan view, this stamping, this branding, this image creation, does it lead to sort of a good Manichaean view of reality?
Who wants to take the Manichaean view on?
If people identify with a party, they are very, very likely to think that bad things are associated with the other party. That doesn't have to be Manichaean, I don't think. I mean, you can recognize good qualities on the other side, and besides, given the very structure of our government, cooperation across party lines becomes a necessity, and it will, in all kinds of settings. So I think actually, no matter how strong the impulse is, the very nature of the Congress, for example, the need to reach 60 votes, whether in the Senate, reach to cloture, all sorts of things require cooperation, and so I don't think it's likely to descend to as dire a picture as you are suggesting.
Yes.
I would have to say ever and always that this is the way it's always been. Do I think it's getting more that way? I don't think so. I mean, I think we keep reinventing how it plays out. At the very end, there are always going to be in-groups and out-groups and us versus them, and that is a part and parcel of what democracy is. And the fact that we have more astute strategists who keep coming along and generate new images, all that simply suggests is, if anything, we're now maybe at a new level of campaigning where we let people look behind the scenes a little bit more than maybe we did in the past. But then that simply means that what's behind the scenes is being managed a little bit more. And so there's still like a second derivative of what's going on. And that may continue to change, but it's always going to be the same.
I think that's a great place to end. We're always going to be manipulated. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Steve. I hope everybody's happy on November 5th.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Tatey's events is available at philiptatey.org.